This is the story of my daughter Amy Alice Mills, who was born yesterday, and she had passed away at 8 weeks gestation, and I delivered her when I was, or should have been, 10 weeks and 3 days pregnant. So it is our first miscarriage, and she was our 5th child. And we did the sneak peek gender blood test, which is how we know she was a little girl. And I just wanted to talk you through 2 stages for anyone who wants to learn sort of how a natural miscarriage can unfold and what it can look like. Give you a little bit of the background of the lead up to finding out that we had lost her, and then going into the detail of the miscarriage yesterday. So back in late November, very late November, I got investigations for ectopic pregnancy because I was having a lot of tummy pain. And I didn't have ectopic pregnancy, but during that process they did blood work and they test your HCG, and over a 3-day period it should double, and mine had only increased by less than 50%. So that automatically means that you're at a higher risk of miscarriage. And I knew that quite early on in my pregnancy, but they kept scanning me. And then at 7 weeks, we had an ultrasound where we saw her. We saw her heartbeat. She was growing well. She was about 4 days smaller than where I believed she should have been, because I do know when I ovulated. So they pushed my due date back further than it needed to be. So she was a little bit undersized, but she was growing. And they had said that anything within 4 days is normal. And at that point they said, she's growing, she's got a heartbeat, you don't need to worry about the bloods. But then I had an ultrasound scheduled for the 2nd of January 2025, and I actually sort of tried to cancel it. On the 1st, I did 23 hours of birth support for a friend. So she's a young single mum, and I had the privilege of being by her side during that birth. And so that was amazing. Got to see her son be born just before midnight on the 1st, and then 9 hours later went in for my ultrasound. So I had been trying to call the ultrasound place, letting them know. I didn't know how long this birth was going to take. I didn't know if I'd be able to make the scan in the morning. But it was a public holiday, so they weren't there, so they didn't answer. And that is a relief, because I am glad that I had the ultrasound, because we ultimately found out that she had passed at that ultrasound. So it was supposed to be 9 weeks. She was only measuring 8 weeks, and I knew what I was looking at. So I had got home. I'd only had 2 hours of sleep. Like, I was so exhausted. I was shaking like crazy. My body had nothing left to give me. But I got Steve and our 4 kids, and we went down to the ultrasound together. And I think the ultrasound tech freaked out because of the kids. She just didn't say anything, and I knew what it should look like. I've had enough ultrasounds. We'd seen her just 2 weeks beforehand. You should see sort of a black bit where the heart is, and it should flicker. And on the they pull up the sound thing, and there should be sound waves which they measure to figure out how fast the heart is beating. But that was a flat line, and there was nothing on the scan. So I said to the ultrasound tech, "There's no heartbeat, is there?" And she, like, barely audibly was like, "No." So that was really hard, obviously. I broke down in tears, specifically telling the kids, because they didn't understand what that meant. So having to actually explain that was really hard. And I already had been under the care of the early pregnancy team at my local hospital because of the ectopic investigations. So I was able to just call them, and they sent the ultrasounds through, and they kind of streamlined me through there. So I had appointments booked in straight away with them. So that was the 2nd of January when we found out. And then they scheduled me for an appointment the following Monday. And they said to me on that phone call, because you are under 9 weeks in pregnancy, you'll come in on Monday, you'll meet with the doctors, and you will get the misoprostol tablets to take home in case you want to use them. I had already told them I wasn't certain whether I wanted to wait for a natural miscarriage or to use the medicines, but I knew I didn't want a D&C unless I absolutely needed one for a medical reason. because I didn't want the scar tissue from it. I've never had any uterine surgery, and so unless I need it, I didn't want it. And I also wanted to bury her. It was really important to me, and I just hated the thought of her being discarded as medical waste. So I went in for the appointment on the Monday with my husband, and it was a very confusing appointment. So I asked them to rescan me. I said, lots of tears that appointment. And I said, I knew there wasn't a heartbeat. I wasn't expecting there to be a heartbeat, but I cannot take that medication until I know, until I've had it confirmed by someone else. It was really good. They talked me through what they were looking at, what they were not seeing. So that gave me more peace about taking the medicine if I needed to. But then I went through to the doctors, and they said they would not give me the medicine. They did not want me to miscarry at home. Baby was too big, and there was a risk of her getting stuck, and it was just really confusing because it wasn't what they'd told me in the past. And so a lot of tears that day, and a lot of talking with my husband, because I've home birthed my other kids, and I'd always said if someone told me I need to be in hospital, I would be in hospital. And I was really wrestling with that because I'm like, I've got these doctors telling me I need to be in hospital, but it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to all my friends that I've talked about who've had losses at the same stage. They went home with the meds. It just didn't make sense. So the next morning, I kind of come to peace with it. I called and I said, well, can I book in for the 28th? Because I wanted to push it back. I was like, if I'm going to have to be in hospital. In that meeting, they also told me that I would be either in a shared room or a private room. I couldn't be guaranteed to not have a stranger next to me while I'm miscarrying. So while they're demanding that I book into hospital, I might be doing it next to a stranger, and that Steve would have to leave outside of visiting hours. So I was possibly going to be alone in a hospital next to a stranger miscarrying. So it was just an awful appointment, really, really awful. And but I called back in the morning and I was like, okay, because they say that you're allowed up to 6 weeks before they really worry about infection risk. So I pushed it right back. I was like, let's do the 28th. But that midwife that I was talking to was like, this doesn't make any sense. You're under 9 weeks. Anyone who is under 9 weeks gets sent home with the medicine. It doesn't make sense. So she spoke to another doctor and he was happy to give me the meds. So I went back in on Tuesday. And that was weird because it's obviously... they're the team who help women who are miscarrying or who are at high risk of miscarriage. And so a lot of sad faces in the waiting room. And that was me literally the day before. I was literally there crying and very sad about it. But that day I was just so relieved because after everything, being told I'd be possibly next to a stranger, possibly without my husband, it was just so overwhelming. And so on the Tuesday, I was just happy as Larry. You would not have thought I was talking about medication to force my body to miscarry. It was weird. It was a weird appointment. But I was glad to have the meds. They sort of described everything, explained it all. And I had decided that I would use the meds by the 15th. There were two sort of factors to that. I have a friend who's had 9 losses, and she was so generous and just helpful in talking to me and supporting me through it. And so she had said she'd always given herself 2 weeks, and that the vast majority of the time that was enough. Her body recognized. And then the few times that it didn't, she needed the meds. And so I felt like that was a reasonable amount of time to give my body rather than the full 6 weeks. And then I also talked to my auntie, who's a retired midwife, and she said her framework for that decision is always, how do I protect future fertility? Because even though it's a low risk of infection, there is still a risk of infection, and infections in the uterus can lead to infertility issues. So I felt really good about the 2 weeks. I felt like the 15th was enough time, and if I needed to take the meds, I needed to take the meds. So I'd sort of teed up babysitters and all of that. But then on the 11th, I started bleeding, but I only bled for 4 hours, and it was fairly minimal, and then it sort of all just disappeared. So the next morning was the 12th, obviously, but it was a Sunday morning, and my husband Steve was preaching, of all things. He hardly ever preaches, but our minister was away, so he was preaching, and my twin sister came over. I started at 8 a.m. I started getting the cramping and the bleeding again, and So I got my sister over because I was like, I just don't want to be home alone and have it all kick in. So she was here with me most of the time, and not really much was happening. Like, I had very minimal pain, very minimal bleeding, and it got to the end of the service and she said, oh, okay, well, I'll go down and Steve will be back soon. And I thought, there's probably like half an hour where she's not going to be here and he'll be at church. And I thought that would be fine. And then, of course, she leaves. And I don't know, probably within about 15 minutes, I had passed my baby, Amy, in the toilet. So into a urinary pan. I had a urinary pan at the front of the toilet, and that caught her. And it was just so bizarre to me that, of course, I'm here home alone after like meticulously trying to plan everything to not be alone. But I still had barely, like, it was very manageable pain at that point. But it just all of a sudden was really heavy bleeding. And so I did call Steve and I'm like, can you come home? Because it was very, very heavy. So that's really what kicked it all off at midday. So even though it had started at 8 a.m., the really heavy and intense bleeding kicked off at midday when she passed. And then there was a lot of blood. And the hospital's metric was, if you flood 4 pads in 2 hours, you need to come into the emergency. And I flooded 3 pads in 2 hours. And there was just so much blood. So I was feeling like I was probably, hitting that limit of like, I've lost a lot. And then it sort of continued with a full pad every hour. So it was the first 2 hours. So that must have been until 2 o'clock. And then so for the following 4 hours, every hour I was completely flooding. Like, I had an adult nappy with a big pad in it, and I'd completely flood through that at least every 45 minutes to an hour. And so it got to 6 p.m. and I was worried about it. I was getting to that point where I'm like, this is just going on and on and on. There were so many clots, and really big clots, like huge. And I called my auntie, the midwife, and just talked through what was happening. And she said, as long as I'm not having gushing blood, which I wasn't, and as long as I still feel well, I'm not faint, I'm not dizzy, I don't have a temperature, my heart rate, blood pressure is all good. As long as I'm still feeling well, then it's okay, and I can just keep monitoring it. And at that point, we sort of agreed that since I was concerned, I would go in the next, hour or so if it didn't calm down. But it was at that point exactly that it started to calm down. So from 6 till 7, the amount of blood loss halved, and then it was about that same amount of blood loss 7 till 8. And then from 8 p.m. it dropped right off to probably just like a normal period sort of level. But it was full on. I think that was the one thing that the hospital, the language they use is, it's like a very heavy period. It's nothing like a very heavy period. Like, maybe if you have problems on your period, I have heavy periods as a, general rule of thumb. This is nothing like a period at all. It was so full on. And I think if I didn't have so much support from my friend who has experience with her miscarriages, and my auntie who's a retired midwife, like, being able to talk through with them and talk about what is and isn't normal was so helpful and so comforting. And it's very unrealistic expectations to say that it's like a heavy period. It's nothing at all like a period at all. So I was fairly confident that I had caught her and identified her from that first clump that passed. But I did go through all of the clots because I didn't want to be wrong. I really wanted to bury her. But it was very distinct. There was a sac, a pregnancy sac. There was like a tiny little thin umbilical cord coming out of it, and like a tiny little placenta attached to the end of it. And then I used tweezers really carefully to open up that sac. It was really full of blood, and so I couldn't see her. At 8 weeks gestation, sometimes you can see their head and like their little eye, and not literally their eye, but their eye socket sort of thing. But I couldn't see that detail because there was too much blood. I just couldn't get it clean, and I didn't want to keep poking with the tweezers. But I could see the exact shape that we had seen on the ultrasound, with her little head and her little body curved around. It was obviously sort of attached to the umbilical cord. So I was fairly confident I had identified her. I just didn't want to be wrong. I just, it gave me more peace sort of sifting through everything and making sure that I'd actually found her. So we're going to get ready to bury her tomorrow. And it's kind of the one thing that I didn't properly prepare. I've got to figure out what box I'd like to bury her in and all of those things. So we're just going to go through that tomorrow, get it organised. My 2 older kids asked to see her. I described, they kept wanting to come into the bathroom, and I was like, no, this is so confronting, there's so much blood, like, just no, don't come in. But they really wanted to see her. I described it and asked them if they were sure. They said they did. So they both saw her. My son was very cute. He's like, so it's like blood in the shape of a baby. I'm like, pretty much, because it was just so much blood. It just you couldn't tell the details, whereas there are pictures online that do show sort of more like translucent skin and stuff. I couldn't get that far because of the condition that she was in, and that's fine. I'm confident that I identified her and I've been able to bury her, which is the thing that I wanted to be able to do. So that's pretty much my miscarriage story. I hope that maybe it helps someone who's facing a natural miscarriage. Maybe I realized afterwards, once I started bleeding naturally, that I had just assumed I would need to take the medication because I had no signs and symptoms. Like, I would not have known she was gone if not for that ultrasound, and I'm really glad I had the ultrasound. But I had sort of convinced myself that I was going to need to take the meds, and then I didn't know what to expect with a natural miscarriage. I didn't sort of have any expectations around it. So maybe that will help someone just to hear what it's like. And yeah, if you're going through this, I am very sorry for your loss, and hope that you're able to process it and find peace about it all as well. Lots of love.